All good. Great, and happy to consent to record. So as Michael kindly introduced, my name is Dr. Phelan Lewis. I'm going to be discussing children and who are carers in their family and where they position in the terms of child labor. I'm currently a researcher at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. If my slide will advance, there we go. So who are young carers and young adult carers? There is a definition that academics in the field typically use, and that defines young carers as children and young persons under the age of 18 who provide or intend to provide care, assistance, and support to another family member. They carry out, often on a regular basis, significant or substantial caring tasks and assume a level of responsibility which would usually be associated with an adult. The person receiving care is often a parent, but as we know, it can be a sibling, a parent, another relative. And I'd also add, it could also be a friend, a romantic partner, a neighbor, anyone else in the child's sphere who is disabled, has a chronic illness, a mental health problem, addiction, or any other type of condition that's connected with a need for care, support, and supervision. And that definition was penned by Professor Saul Becker, who actually coined the term young carers and was my PhD advisor many years ago. A young adult carers is a term that you may also be familiar with, and that's typically thought of to be the same definition, but for those young adults aged 18 to 24. And you might hear young adult carers referred to at the ages of 16 to 17 years old, but we often think of those as young adult carers in transition, as they transition from childhood to adolescence to adulthood. So I have a secret to reveal, which is that I am just not a researcher. I actually have lived experience as a youth caregiver, as a young carer myself. So growing up in the US in Nashville, Tennessee, about 20 years ago, pictured there around that time, my mother, who was a generally pretty healthy woman, she was diagnosed with degenerative disc disease and had what should have been a routine surgery for her condition on her spine go horribly wrong. The surgeon took out bones from her spine that he shouldn't have, and that left my mother, who should have been in the hospital for about a weekend, needing to be there for weeks, needing to relearn how to walk, and was classified as permanently disabled and no longer able to return to work as a nurse. I have an older brother, 7 years older than me. At the time, he came home from university and began caring for both me and my mother. As a young adult, and then me as a child at 11, that meant we started helping in terms of intimate care tasks for my mother. So washing, showering, bathing, helping her get dressed. She had subsequent surgeries after that. So that meant we were doing wound care. I was helping her walk, giving her medicines. My brother at 19, he took on our mortgage for the house. He got an outside job, began paying our household bills, and our world completely was enveloped into caregiving tasks for our mother. That role continued to today. I want to be clear, though, that my brother and I were not in isolation. There are millions of other children and young adults with caring roles in their family and those in their sphere of influence. In the UK, estimates recently looked to 800,000 young carers. In the US, new figures from 2020 would say there's about 5.4 million children with a caregiving role in their family. And you can generally see the percentage looks about the same, and some differences across some of the countries that we do know that we have explicit dedicated research for young carers. It is a field that is continuing to grow over the last decade. So if you don't see your country spotted there, I would love to hear at the end of our presentation today your own experience of what children with a caring role might look like in your prospective country. So children become carers for a variety of reasons. What often comes to mind first is that sense of duty. It may be a part of their family practice and also their cultural practice as well. So we know that in many cultures, particularly those in Asia and Africa, that may be seen as a normalized part of the family experience, particularly in households where there are multiple generations living and engaging together. It may also simply be because of the presence of disability, poverty, illness. And it's incredibly important to note that when you speak to young carers, they also say that, yes, I am caring because of duty or because that's what's expected of me because I'm a girl. But I also care for my family member out of love. And finally, what is often true for many young carers around the world is simply there are no alternatives. They are the safety net, which I would say, of a failed social care and healthcare system for them needing to step into caring roles in their family. So young carers can also do a number of tasks, ranging from domestic tasks like washing, cleaning, cooking food. They may engage in household management, like doing the food shop for the household repairs, lifting heavy objects, intimate care, like what I performed for my mother, like washing, dressing, giving medicine. Emotional care, which continues to kind of be debated in the work of young carers. Emotional care means spending time with the care recipient, reading with them, listening, telling jokes, having conversation with that person. Many young carers often engage in what we call sibling care. So they may look after a sibling who may or may not have an illness or disability themselves. And they also may look after a sibling with or without a parent present in the home. They also engage in financial care. They may get an outside paid job. They may pay household bills, arrange government benefits. And then lastly, we look at practical care. What's often common for young carers, particularly those who maybe are refugees or immigrants to their country that they're living in at the moment, would say language interpretation. So engaging in, particularly for services, doing some language interpretation on behalf of their family. There are also a large amount of outcomes when you look at the impacts of young caring, both negative and positive. The first might be the idea of restricted friendships. So their friendship groups might be smaller. And in the age of technology, if that's something they have access to, their friendship groups may be online. We also talk about stigma by association. So when we think of some of the health conditions that their cared for person may have, might be a visible physical disability, it might be mental illness, an addiction, a substance addiction, they may experience stigma and as an association with the person that they cared for. Bullying is a significant experience that's reported by young carers around the world. They experience fear and anxiety. There may be a practice of secret and silence within the family. Sometimes there can be a fear that social services may get involved and young caring may be interpreted by social services as neglect. Emotional problems. So I mentioned anxiety. There's also depression. And in some of my more recent work, we're discovering significant numbers of young carers, young adult carers, reporting self-harm and suicidal thoughts in connection with their caring role. They're also at risk for physical health problems. So I mentioned about some of the household tasks they might do, which might be lifting heavy objects. They also may experience back strain from lifting the cared for person, and also headaches, some lack of sleep or stress. It's also incredibly important that we emphasize the positive outcomes from young caring: resilience, responsibility, maturity, skills that are useful and transferable into paid work outside of the home. Also inclusion. So what I love hearing when I speak to young carers and young adult carers is this sense of community. Again, many say that they're doing it out of love. They can tell a difference from their non-caring peers in the sense that they're more altruistic. They care about the world around them. They might also feel that their personality is even a bit different from their other peers. It is helpful for us when we want to start thinking about young carers in the context of child labor as a continuum of care. And this continuum comes from Saul Becker, the academic I mentioned earlier today. So that would suggest that there's a continuum of children's care. So all children care about someone, or most children, maybe to be safe to say, care about someone. That might mean that they are engaging in chores in the home. Of course, they may look after their siblings. We might use that term babysitting. And there's perhaps, from the research, we'd say maybe a little terms of negative impacts associated with those type of caring activities. But as we move along that continuum, where caring responsibilities continue to increase, the complexity increases, the time involved increases. We also start to begin looking at children who are caring for. So that means they engage in high levels of care and responsibility. This is fewer children, although as you saw from the statistics earlier, that is still a high number of children globally. Significant, regular, and substantial caring tasks. And there also begins to see evidence of significant negative outcomes, particularly with mental health and physical health. One of the frameworks that tends to guide the academics in the young carer sphere is the interpretation of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. It's thought of that convention places children's rights to the relationship with the child rather than on the parent and the state. And that is usually used by young carers academics to set the standards for the rights of young carers. One of the agreements coming out of the Third International Young Carers Conference was to say that every child has a right to, looking at the Convention of the Rights of the Child. But what they might say is that young carers are experiencing a loss of those rights, a right to thrive, to have happy childhoods, and to look and have hope for their future. The UN Convention of the Rights of the Child also helps to guide recognition, the definition, and understanding of young carers. That's generally guided the work of academics in Europe and Australia, but academics also hold up the United States, the country from which I'm from, as an opposing example, as it is one of the few countries who has not ratified the UN Convention of the Rights of the Child. And that is seen by young carers academics as one of the reasons why the US is about 30 years behind in terms of policy, practice, and research in the field of young carers specifically. It's seen that there's an emphasis in the US on parental rights. And since much of the work and the movement to support young carers and make sure that they have a right to being heard in their family has been undergirded by the convention, it's seen that that's perhaps a reason why that work has not progressed in the US. It's also helpful for us to start thinking about care and labor in the public and private sphere, just more generally. So Joan Tronto, one of our care ethics academics, speaks about care relations existing not in a vacuum, but it's influenced by public and private spheres. There's also the thought that care is relational, political, ethical, and also recognizing that care around the world can be seen as a paid transactional basis, where you may have large groups of individuals moving across the world to enact and paid caregiving in the home and the private sphere, and in public spaces, such as giving care as a paid worker in a care home. And subsequently, care is gendered, classed, and racialized. In the US, currently, there's more of a talk about care being seen as infrastructure. So you might have heard of the Build Back Better bill that's been promulgated at the moment in the US. And that's seen to think of care for either domestic care, so paid care, or unpaid family caregiving as the infrastructure for all services in the US. That's how life functions in society, is through the care work of people in the home. There's also the thought now, in terms of the argument about care and labor, that if family caregiving can reflect the same tasks that paid carers, domestic workers undertake, some then argue that unpaid family caregiving is indeed work. And that's kind of the premise that we'll work from for the rest of our discussion from today. So when you look at child labor and child welfare laws, I wonder if there's relevance for young carers. I'll use the US as an example again. So US child federal labor laws, they may help form some specific arguments for legal protection for young carers. I should say that currently there are no specific laws in the state or federal system that mention children of caring roles. The Fair Labor Standards Act minimum age requirements do not apply to minors employed by their parents. So children can work and be employed by their parents in a paid capacity. But some of the rights that we look at with the Fair Labor Federal Act, do not apply to those children. And that again might signal the ways that society there tends to emphasize parental rights over rights of children. In the UK, in terms of child labor laws, there are also restrictions on paid child employment. I'll pick up some things that might be relevant as we think about young carers. For example, there are restrictions in terms of children not being allowed to work before 7 a.m. and after 7 p.m., for more than 1 hour before school, for more than 4 hours without taking a break for at least 1 hour, and any work that may be harmful to their health, well-being, or education. And at the very bottom there, during term time, so meaning when they're in school, children can only work a maximum of 12 hours a week. What's important to keep in mind, though, if you want to start thinking about unpaid family caregiving as work, young carers typically are engaged in family caregiving before 7 a.m., before they go to school, sometimes during school, and after school, in the evenings, in the overnight hours. It's also been found in our research that young carers are engaging in caring tasks for more than 12 hours a week. Some report up to 30, 40 hours a week. So you can imagine how, when you start thinking about what's allowed for children, what's not allowed in terms of restrictions on child employment, how that might fit and how that might kind of frame the way we think about labor for young carers. So if young caring is work, that then moves us on to, should it be paid? So let's look at, for example, the UK Cares Allowance. And I would love if we have time to hear about if you have a similar type of allowance or benefit in your respective country. So currently, the UK Cares Allowance is about £67 a week, and that's for if you care for someone 35 hours a week, and that person already receives a certain benefit. You must be 16 years or older. You're not in full-time education. You're not studying for more than 21 hours or more a week. And if you care for someone, if someone else also cares for the same person as you, only one of you can claim the carer's allowance. So what you start to hear, particularly in the UK with young carers and young adult carers, is this sense that they are being excluded from a paid benefit that they feel is entitled to them. So if you're under the age of 16, you cannot be paid for the contributions that you're making to your family. If you're involved in education, which many of them say, I'm balancing school, college, university, and I want to also be paid for the work that I'm doing with my family, that's excluded to you. And we also know that young carers often we use a term we call share the care. So they may be sharing their care responsibilities with either a parent or another sibling or someone else in the home or outside of the home. And if that's happening then, which is typically the case, that would also mean they're excluded from the carer's allowance. So I want us to start thinking now as we move towards our discussion time, should children care in a good moral society? Much of the work still in academia in this particular set of children still looks at whether or not children should even be carers. Is that a hallmark of a good society? But I think what we're really starting to ask, if we think about when adults engage in care work, as we think of that as work, should children work in a good moral society? I think that's also what we're starting to think of. Now, I'll share some of my views, and I have my caveat to say that that's a work in progress and influenced as I continue to read and think and talk to experts like yourselves. I think it's important to keep in mind that this notion of childhood as a protected time is relatively recent and a Western ideal. So what tends to also kind of gird some of the work with, and I should say some of the research of young carers, is that childhood is a protected time. It's the scene that children have a right to not work, to not be burdened, to be free, to be happy. And that is generally, as childhood being a separate concept of time, is relatively recent. If we also take the view of family caregiving as work and labor, especially when we compare it to engaging in the same tasks as paid carers and domestic workers, I argue that family caregivers of all ages should be paid. And how might we do that? If we use a continuum of care, so that remind you again that all children, or most children, care about someone, and then they move along that continuum to caring for someone. Combine that with the presence of family disability, illness, or addiction, perhaps that's a way to means test. Those are some of my thinking, and that again is all still in an organic, fluid place, and I would love to take this time to hear your views. I understand we might move into a Q&A and then further breakout rooms. thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to engaging in this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phelan, for that very